Our next panel should be very interesting and is going to touch on a different aspect of some of what we've been talking about, and that's the role of journalism and the media. And we're going to be talking about the role of social media, which in some ways has really taken things in a different direction. Some might say a little bit more harshly. Others would say that it really creates an opportunity for more disciplinary dialogue and discussion in a way that we weren't able to before. Our moderator today is Professor Bob Boynton from the Department of Political Science at the University of Iowa, and I need to thank him publicly very much for stepping in on one day's notice because the moderator that was supposed to have had a personal family emergency, and Bob was very willing to do this, and we really appreciate that. His research interests include American politics, comparative politics, and international relations, and his most recent work is on global news broadcasting and English federalism, but he also has done a lot of work looking at new media and the term social media, new media. We'll let the panel sort of discuss that a little bit and the role of those things, because I think it does affect what we're talking about, but it also just kind of points out the fact that different people have a lot of different perspectives. So with that, Professor Boynton.
Okay. We don't need to stand up.
You can do that from the mic.
We can do it here? All right. Let me be sure that. All right. So in the back, do you hear me? Closer? Okay. How's this? Better?
Hello.
Is that okay? All right. Because this is going to be a discussion, and so we don't need to have people coming up and standing behind the podium for at least in very much. Okay. Well, what we're going to do is I'm going to do a brief introduction about social media, and just to remind you of what you already know and to tell you some things that you may well not know. Then I have three experts here who are going to help us talk about social media, conflictual politics, contentious politics, and civility in political discourse. Civility in political discourse is what our panel is about, and they didn't get it. You guys get it? Well, doesn't matter. I was going to show you pictures, but there. Okay, there you are. Okay, the reason for putting up this picture is Occupy the Earth. As I'm sure you all know, Occupy is going around these days as a primary generator of political discourse, political conflict. And the reason I wanted to show this picture is because the discourse, which is going on in lots of different venues, including Twitter and Facebook and all these others, is also going on the ground. That is, they're not, the social media and what's happening in the rest of the world are not disconnected. They are intimately connected. And so that the social media become a way in which people organize themselves, a way in which they express themselves to the rest of the world about their concerns, and a way in which they come together and do things like this. Or they spend the night in the D.C., which is where one of our panelists is from. There's an Occupy D.C., and it's actually got a big park, and they're spending the night, and the same is true in Iowa. We have our own Iowa City, Occupy Iowa City. It's not exactly huge. I have a friend who I have dinner with occasionally, and each time he says, well, I went by this afternoon and there was only one person there, or, he reports to me how many people were there. All right. What I want to do is I want to remind you of how new this is. Email was 40 years old last month. Now, if I look at the audience, there are several people in the audience who have been around as long as email, including me, of course. So electronic communication is really very, very new. That is, it's within the lifetime of many of the people sitting in this room. Blogging, which is a second kind of social communication, social media, got its start in the 1990s, probably in the late 1990s, so it's been around for that amount of time. And we have a blogger here, and he can tell you about blogging. I won't do that, but it became very popular and has developed considerably over the 20 years in which it's been around. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are much newer. They're all a product of the first decade of the 21st century. They're roughly 5 years old, 6 years old. So that means that this is something which is brand new to our experience. All of a sudden, we have the ability to communicate in ways that we have never been able to communicate before, to audiences that we can reach audiences that we've never been able to reach before. And this is really big stuff. As you all probably know, Facebook is a gigantic membership organization. There are now 800 million people, 800 million accounts, user accounts at Facebook. Now, not all of them are active, but as you may guess, they're not all in the United States. They're not all Americans. This is a global phenomenon, and they're just waiting until they can get themselves into China, when it will double the population, the Facebook population, or something like that. Twitter is smaller. It has 200 million people, user accounts. 100 million of those accounts are accessed at least once a month. 50 million of those are accessed at least once a day. So you've got at least every day 50 million people who are showing up and they're writing messages. Tumblr, which is a small blogging platform, there are bigger blogging platforms than Tumblr, but Tumblr is a small blogging platform which just went from 1 billion pages being uploaded and displayed there in 1 year to 10 billion pages being uploaded and displayed there. So in this last year, there were 10 billion pages that were put onto Tumblr. There are more than 250 million sentences, i.e. Twitter messages, which are 140 characters, which means they're sentences. But there are something over 250 million Twitter messages a day, which means every week there are 1.5 billion sentences that are running through Twitter. And YouTube works this way. At least 6 months ago, which is now probably out of date, 6 months ago there was 48 hours of video uploaded every single minute to YouTube. Now imagine that. You would never be able to catch up, right? You were trying, they're going up faster than you can possibly. So the point here is that there is a lot of this stuff. It is very widespread. It makes for communication possibilities that really are quite dramatically different from what we've had in the past. All right. So that's my sort of introduction to the phenomenon that we're looking at. This is the phenomenon that we're looking at. How it gets used, at least for political purposes, is what we're going to talk about for the next hour or so. All right. And let's see. Now. Okay. All right, so I would like to, so what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Julia, and she's going to talk for a few minutes about the use of Twitter messages in conflictual situations and what civility would be like, and then I'm going to go down and introduce John and John. And so Julia is at the Center for American Progress, which is an organization in Washington, D.C. That spends its time thinking about what policy might be to improve the future of the country. She's working on multicultural development in the United States and what that's going to look like over time. And she just finished her PhD and was awarded a PhD 1 year ago.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone who was part of organizing this panel. I can't tell you how many people were jealous once they heard the topic of this panel compared to a lot of other dry presentations we have to give in the field. But so, we were asked to talk a little bit about specifically how we came to work in social media. And for me, that's really a two-part answer. Prior to my life at CAP, my dissertation really looked a lot at social media and its impact on fighting Islamophobia, not only in Western Europe, but also in the United States. And because of this, I have a pretty positive impression of social media, and which I hope we'll talk through today, because I know it's a controversial and somewhat inflammatory topic. But I was looking at activists' access points, that they use through social media, creating alternative media outlets when they felt that they were unfairly portrayed in the mainstream media. So this is really what sort of triggered my interest in looking at social media's impact on policy and social discourse. And now my work at CAP has really honed in on the importance of social media, because the Center for American Progress was founded in 2003 under the premise that, progressives can have great ideas, but unless we're communicating those effectively, then, they're falling on deaf ears. And social media became a very important part of that agenda, not only how to encourage dialogue to come up with progressive public policy, but to make sure that progressive ideas were getting strong representation, we're having a strong voice in that dialogue. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how we've actually done this, but I think the topic of this symposium, specifically conflict and civility in political discourse, is incredibly timely. At CAP earlier this year, prompted by the unfortunate shooting of Representative Giffords in January, we had an event called Choosing Our Words Carefully, where we brought together some polling experts and other advocates on the issue of civility in politics. And I encourage all of you to look at it. It's live streamed online. The link is still alive. But, what this topic really started to pull apart is this issue of how do we make sure that our political discourse isn't inciting violence, isn't inciting hatred? And, we showed research that looks at the 2010 elections and says, these elections were more negative, far more negative than any previous election we've polled in this way. So what's going on, And the public, research also shows, the public is increasingly worried that this tone in our political discourse is becoming more and more negative. And so what folks at this event really talked about was how the media is hugely influential in this, and that instead of the media sort of stirring the pot, what's happening is certain media sources, specifically Fox News and public television, are becoming by far the strongest predictors of people's political views. This is controlling for other types of variables, your education, your party ideology, a number of other variables. So controlling for those, these news sources are still acting as very strong predictors. So why is the media so influential in our political views? And I think the quote that came away from this event, or that resonated most strongly with me, is James Zogby's analysis of the situation. He's the president of the Arab American Institute, and he does a lot of work on discrimination issues. And he said, the problem is not people not knowing, it's people thinking that they know. Being ignorant can be difficult, but being ignorant and thinking you're right is dangerous. And I think this is one of the problems that we're seeing in the connection between media and political discourse. And I think that dangerousness comes from incivility, not just being about disagreement, because, disagreement provides for lively debate. I think we have to pull apart those two terms, but incivility isn't just about disagreement, it's about dehumanizing certain groups of people. And I think that's really at the heart of this. And so when you can give rise to stereotypes or profiling or, slander people and personal attacks in political discourse, what that's doing is dehumanizing groups of people so that they're not even taken seriously or that they're demonized by other people. And facts sort of, fall aside. They fall to the back. And I think that this situation has become worse as, the recession has hit, so there's a lot of economic anxiety. And then there's anxiety about specifically what my project at the Center for American Progress, a new project called Progress 2050, focuses on. And this is how America is changing. By 2050, we're going to be a very different country. We're going to be a majority of communities of color. And with these demographic shifts, I think what we're seeing is a rise in anxiety about what it means to be American. That sort of Protestant white identity is, changing, as American identity has always changed. But our project tries to talk about, how can our progressive policy agenda really be more reflective of diversity, racial and ethnic diversity? And what does social media have to do with all of this? I think, again, like I introduced myself through the remarks, that I'm an incredible believer in the power of social media, despite all this danger that I just went through, in civil discourse, maybe inciting violence, inciting disrespect, dehumanizing people. We still have seen that social media has provided incredible access points. For example, communities of color, minority usage of social media far outnumbers their non-Hispanic white counterparts. So we're seeing the ability of people to enter political discourse through this media alternative. So if a lot of the in civil discourse is about dehumanizing certain groups, we're seeing the potential for the same groups who are being dehumanized to enter the discourse and to fight the discourse themselves. Excuse me. And then finally, we're also seeing that social media, has a specific role to play in this discussion of civility and politics that the mainstream media hasn't done so great on. Last year, there was some research done by a firm, Weber and Shandwick, on civility in America, and they showed that social media actually fares better than all other sources of incivility online. And, they start talking about some of the specific reasons, and part of it could be codes of conduct, rules of engagement that social media really encourages in a way that the mainstream media and its one-directional influence on political discourse is not incapable of, but they haven't met those standards yet. And so social media, I think, encourages conversation and dialogue in a way that makes us reassess what are those codes of conduct, what are those rules of engagement. And so I hope we talk about that today. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so next is John Deeth. John Deeth is an Iowa City blogger who is blogging about Iowa politics and who is active in the Democratic Party, and he's got his hat on.
The hat is actually sort of an inadvertent gimmick that came along about 4 or 5 years ago, but I figured I'd disappoint some of my friends if I didn't bring it along. My roots in social media and the roots of social media go back to the very dawning days of the internet. Some of you Iowa Cityans here may remember the old ISCA BBS that dated back to at least the early 1990s when I arrived in Iowa City, and there were political forums on there, and some of the controversies in social media actually date that far back. The question of moderation of forums versus unfettered free speech, and the permanent question of troll control within a social media setting. I began my career in Iowa City as a traditional professional journalist for public radio, and I enjoyed that role, but I was somewhat uncomfortable because of the paradigm of journalistic objectivity. I was expected to maintain this neutrality, and I felt in conflict between my role there and my role as a political activist. And eventually I abandoned journalism for a long, long time to be more directly involved in the political process as a campaign staffer, eventually as a failed candidate for office, and then I settled about 14 years ago as a staff member for a local elected official. And my return to social media came about somewhat inadvertently late in 2002. Blogs are actually now kind of old school for social media. The Facebook and Twitter and the other newer social media have largely taken off in the last 4 or 5 years, and a blog is sort of old school. But I started blogging at the very end of 2002 just as a personal diversion, just for something to do with my spare time. And, threw up a few news links here, a few cat pictures there, the usual personal stuff. And then in about 2006 or so, I started to realize that when I wrote seriously about local and state politics, people were actually reading that and taking it seriously. And along about that era, a critical mass developed of other writers, self-published writers in Iowa and various parts of the state. Some of those blogs are still going today. Some of them have vanished. Some of them have merged into more professionalized blogs. And so that began to take off, and at that point I decided I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to focus seriously on this. And by mid-2007, I've been rewarded with a return to professional journalism. I wrote professionally for a site called Iowa Independent for a year and a half, covering the caucuses and then the general election. That lasted through the general election. At that time, they cut the staff back significantly. They're still around, and they're still a very good publication, but they've restructured quite a bit. They're part of the Center for Independent Media Network. And then I just continued with the work on my own, and I'm writing part-time for the Des Moines Register now. One of the phenomena I have noticed in social media has been what the old Usenet folks will call the eternal September. Usenet was and is still a sort of social media structure, and that was really the backbone of the early version of the internet back in the into the 80s and into the 90s. And there was a social meme at that time that in September a lot of new university freshmen mostly would get their first access to their first email accounts. They didn't yet know the social norms, and there was a lot of activity that the traditional user base considered inappropriate. Well, about 1993, that new influx of people reached a critical mass so that the old norms were overwhelmed. And the old school folks referred to that as the eternal September. September never ended. You'll still occasionally see references to September 10,423, 1993. So that's a problem that continues. There is still a lot of incivility and anonymity to social media, that it's a never-ending balance of controlling that versus allowing a free and unfettered and equal platform for free speech. So I'm hoping to look more into that as we continue our discussion.
Okay. The third person is John Lauck. He's a senior advisor for Senator Thune of South Dakota. He is a historian who got his PhD from the University of Iowa. He wrote about the election of the senator when he was first elected, and he says that he has just finished an article that's being published now about the Iowa caucuses, a review article about the Iowa caucuses. So he's an expert on Iowa, and
thanks, Bob. The other thing I should mention is a long time ago when I was a grad student here at Iowa City, Bob was on my dissertation committee over in Papa John when Papa John was a brand new building, probably about 1997. So it's good to reconnect with Bob. Thanks to Pete and thanks to David Perlmutter, who I don't think is here, for arranging this panel. I think this is a great idea. I do think that Iowa is a great place to have a session like this because, as Bob mentioned, this is the home of the Iowa caucuses. And if you want to see my latest take on the workings of the Iowa caucuses, see the current issue of the Claremont Review of Books, where I look at about 5 books about the Iowa caucuses and try and make sense of the data in those books in 2,000 words or so.
That is available on the table, which is either came in or as
Excellent. Thanks, Pete. And one of the points I make in that article is that Iowa is a great place to have elections because people are very civil here. I mean, you don't see people yelling at each other in the streets of Iowa or a lot of conflict in Iowa races. I'm sure there are exceptions, but that's not the norm, and I think we can all appreciate that, and that's one of the reasons why the Iowa caucuses is such a good system. I should have an article out next week, too, in the Fortnightly Review that goes into a little bit more depth on the Iowa caucuses. because it's always been very frustrating to me how shallow the writing is about the caucuses at the national level. You know, you have the journalists parachute into Iowa and they report on the latest poll or the latest gaffe or the latest visit by some candidate to some suburb of Des Moines, and they don't give any sort of context or history of Iowa or any deeper perspective on it. And in this article that should be coming out in the next week or so, I talk a lot more about the history of Iowa and what makes this a good place to have civic discussions and civic debates and policy debates. So if you want to know more about that, let me know and I can connect you with, or give you the citation of where it should be. First of all, before I comment on my experience with social media, I just want to make a couple general comments about the issue of civility. I guess I am a glass half full person because I think there are a lot of good things about our political system. Just take a look around the world now at some of the disintegrating states and some of the problems that are going on in Europe and et cetera. There's still a great deal of civility in the American political system. Of course, I work in the U.S. Senate, which goes overboard in terms of the symbolism of civility and the tradition of civility and the language of civility. People always talk about my distinguished colleague and my good friend, and we're going to work out this deal. And John Fortier may have left, but he was talking about the workings of the Senate. And it is true that in order to get things done in the Senate, you need to find, for the most part, a bipartisan co-sponsor for your bills, or they're probably not going to be taken seriously. Now, you can file your bill independently and maybe with 5 or 6 other members of your own party, but in order to cross that threshold of seriousness, it's good to have at least a couple of co-sponsors from the other party, and that tends to be how you get things done. And I know that there's been a lot of friction in the Senate in recent years, of course, but I do think a lot of that is driven by very specific circumstances relating to our fiscal crisis in this country, which we're all going to have to face the music at some point. The debt is out of control, and this Greece situation is now spreading to Italy, and it's going to come to the United States at some point, and we have to face it. And that causes a lot of friction in the Senate. Under more normal circumstances, it does seem to work a little bit better. All right, well, my experience, the other historical point I was going to make is just think how much better it is now. I mean, we're having an argument about fiscal issues and the spending of money, and should money be spent here or on this project, or should we cut this back or spend more here? I mean, we're not debating slavery, we're not debating entry into World War I, we're not debating civil rights or the Vietnam War. Some of these issues that have brought our institutions in Washington to a screeching halt in the past. These are manageable issues, and there's a lot of smart people on both sides that can fix them. It's not an unbridgeable gap. So I guess my message is to have more faith in the system than some people would indicate. But my experience with electronic media, it's funny you mentioned, John, the beginnings of email, et cetera, here in Iowa City. Mm-hmm. I remember when I moved down here in 1993 to go to grad school, one of the things they said was, you need to go to WEG. Mm-hmm. Do you remember WEG? You need to go to WEG.
Still there.
Get some kind of account or whatever. And that was my first experience with email. And first started using email down here at Iowa. And I love email. It's the greatest invention since I don't know what, but it makes my life so much easier. I had to mail some letters last week. I have some relatives that don't use email, et cetera, but it takes so much time to do all of that, which the world of email is fantastic for communications. But I got interested in social media and blogging after the 2002 Senate race in South Dakota, which my current boss, Senator Thune, lost by 500 votes. Elections are often pretty close in South Dakota. I mean, South Dakota is very similar to Iowa. It's very civically engaged, and there's a lot of people that pay a lot of attention to politics, and they get involved. South Dakota has, according to the political scientist Robert Putnam, the highest level of social capital in the country, which means simply that people are extremely involved in their communities and they participate in civic affairs to a great extent. I'm sure Iowa is very high up there too. But I was disappointed in the outcome, and so were some other people in South Dakota. And one of the criticisms of the election was that the news media, primarily the main newspaper in South Dakota, was so one-sided. They were biased in favor of the other candidate. And prior to that, there really wasn't much you could do as a candidate but complain about it. I mean, you could go into the newspaper, you could have an argument with the editor, you could yell back and forth, but it wouldn't actually change anything. But with the rise of blogs, you could actually have a voice. You could change the discourse, as Julie says. You could change the nature of the conversation. And so when it looked like my boss was going to try again to run for the Senate in the next cycle in 2004, we started to think about, hey, let's get organized and have some blogs, and we'll try and make the coverage of the race a little bit more fair. And these were no one had any grand ambitions. We just thought it would be helpful, and it might make the process a little bit more fair for all the candidates involved. And so we started these blogs, and they began to mushroom, and they began to grow in significance, and people were paying a lot more attention to them. And other people out there who felt closed out of the political process began to email in information and news tips and angles on stories that other people were missing. And during this whole process, it was very educational for me, because I had written a lot about politics in the past and had been working as a historian, and I relied very heavily on old newspaper accounts of things that had happened in the past, and I began to think to myself, boy, I wonder how much I'm missing by reading these old newspaper accounts, how much goes unsaid in the political process. And so we began to, in a certain sense, cover the race ourselves and provide alternative sources of information and other viewpoints about the race. And this is not really a partisan issue. It's not left or right. I mean, this can be done on both sides. I'm sure there are newspapers that are biased against Democrats in certain areas too. Anyway, this process goes on. There's growing attention to these blogs. A lot of the people on the mainstream media, as we call them, began to contact us, the bloggers, for information and scoops. And I think one of the key moments in the race is when we were given some old memos, really literally smoking gun memos, about a reporter who had covered South Dakota politics for decades, which indicated how biased he was. I mean, you can always make complaints about, well, I think that story's unfair, you didn't include this, but you can't really prove the intent of the reporter is to favor one candidate or the other. But these memos proved what he was up to. I mean, I don't think you could ever recreate that particular set of circumstances. I mean, people have asked me in the past, well, how did the blogs have an effect? How do we do it? Can we replicate it? Well, the situation was pretty specific, so I don't know if you could. But you could have a major influence on it. And the campaign of our opponent, which was Senator Daschle, had been used to using this reporter and this newspaper for decades to get their message out and to communicate the talking points they wanted out in the public sphere. And when we disrupted that process and the reporter was taken off the race, I think it had a big impact on the race. And after the race was over and Senator Daschle lost by about 4,500 votes or so, his campaign staff told the New Republic that really messed up our campaign strategy, because we had planned from the beginning to be able to plant stories with this reporter all through the campaign, and when this change in circumstances made it impossible for us to do that. So there is a New Republic article about it. If you want a longer account, there's a chapter in my book entitled Daschle versus Thune, Anatomy of a High Plains Senate Race, if you really want to know all the gory details about how this all transpired. So I guess I am in agreement with Julie and mostly with John that although John has more caution, I guess, is throwing more caution flags than I am. But I think social media is great, because I think there was simply too much power concentrated in the hands of a few journalistic gatekeepers who decided what you got to hear about what was going on behind the scenes and what was going on in politics. The sort of brusque, arrogant editor of the New York Times, Howell Raines, once said, he said, I'm the one who decides what news is. You know, I'm the gatekeeper here. And if I think it's news, if the New York Times thinks it's news, then it's news. And if we don't think it's news, if it's not in our paper, it's not news. Well, that's insane. I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives about what's relevant information and what's relevant news. And I mean, it's sort of depressing to think how long our politics functioned when it was so dependent upon the three major networks and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the National AP. I mean, that is a very small funnel through which to pass a lot of important political information. But in this age of social media, that has opened up a great deal. And so on the whole, I think it's a great step forward for democracy and letting everybody's voice be heard.
I would like to follow up that point with a few numbers. And the mainstream media has had sort of monopoly control of the public domain. That is, if you wanted to speak beyond your neighbors, you had to go through newspapers, television, etc. That's really no longer true, because what you have now is a very large amount of communication that's going on in the public domain that's available to any of us who wants to take advantage of it. So there are now something on the order of just over 100,000 Twitter messages a day that mention Mr. Obama. That's a lot of communication about our president. Until very recently, Occupy Wall Street and all of its various cousins was about 200,000 messages a day. So they have generated a huge amount of communication in the context of that. In the Republican campaign, in October, both Romney and Kaine were mentioned in 400,000 messages each. That's in a single month. When there's a debate in the Republican campaign, that spikes up to about 200,000 messages that day. So what you have is, and let me do the Giffords thing because Julie mentioned it, and I think it's worth thinking about. When Representative Giffords was shot in January, 2 days in a row there were 100,000 messages about that shooting and about what had happened in that case. So what we have here is a very large amount of information, a very large voice. That is, people have voice who never had voice before. It's public voice, and that sets Twitter apart from Facebook, which is mostly private voice, that is communication with your friends. And it sets it apart from email, which is clearly private. That is, unless you have a list, the email is going to a single person. But Twitter, at least, is very, very public, and people are taking advantage of this. And then the next question is, well, what about civility in this new public domain where you have all of these hundreds of thousands of messages going out every day? So I'm going to turn to my friends over here and say, okay, what do you think about civility in this new public domain? We've already talked about it a little bit, but let's just sort of say, is there more incivility today, or has it not changed in the last 10 or 20 years?
Well, I guess I would just start off by saying, before when I said that, the recent research shows that social media actually fares really well on grounds of civility compared to other media sources, the exception actually is blogging. Which I'm curious to hear about from John. The theory is that it might have to do with social networking that exists more, like Bob was saying, into the private networks of Facebook or into the more public networks of Twitter. Maybe those social networks do more to keep people in check, and then the problems of anonymity that still a lot of blogs face. Even though more and more sites are imposing standards on comments and trying to crack down on this anonymity problem, maybe the problem of trolling isn't a problem of the past. And so, there are different types of social media too, and I think that should be disaggregated to see where is civility maybe on the rise, where is incivility on the rise, and then try to maybe emulate the ones where civility is actually on the rise.
The anonymity question is interesting because that dates back all the way to those early bulletin board days. I started writing under my real name simply because I didn't know better, and I was in a small minority on that. The difference between blogs versus Facebook, I think if you look at Facebook, the rhetoric of the term friends as your contact, that kind of imposes a little bit of civility, and it sometimes I'll even find myself seeing a request and click and thinking, is this a friend or what is this person? And I've actually turned down I've had a couple of mental stops as those have popped up. In blogging, yeah, we're a little nastier sometimes, and I think that's an expectation of the medium. I'm a big Hunter Thompson fan going back a long ways, and there was a certain amount of bile and venom in that writing, and I think that kind of, I think every blogger fancies themselves as a little Hunter Thompson or P.J. O'Rourke once in a while, and a certain level of what we call snark is necessary to make the writing interesting, to bring in the traffic, and to maybe stir the pot a little bit. And I also know that that's used sometimes by other media, by political activists. I've actually heard the phrase, we can't say that, let's see if we can get the bloggers to do it. And on occasion I've obliged. Yeah, put a story out there that maybe the campaign press secretary didn't want to put out there, but then, oh boy, that gets picked up real quick. So that, as far as the long-range incivility in American politics, all I can say to that is, ma, where's my paw gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. It's a long-standing American tradition, and every generation seems to argue that this is the worst it's ever been, and I'm not convinced of that. There's simply more tools to get it out there.
I just remember the specific quote from Howell Raines was this, quote, "It's not news unless the New York Times decides it's news." I mean, that's kind of the attitude that the bloggers are pushing back against in terms of generating other sources of information for people to consume. Also on that South Dakota Senate race, I think David Perlmutter's, who's the Dean of Arts and Science or the Dean of the Communications School here, he has a book on blog wars. I think there's a chapter in there about
been in a few of those.
But yeah, I agree. I don't think it's on the whole that bad. When I started blogging, I had open comments. People could come on and say whatever, and 95% of the time it was not a problem. I ultimately decided to click the button that said you had to identify yourself officially if you're going to comment on the blog. And then later I just clicked the button saying turning off comments because I didn't want to have to watch the comments. I didn't have time to go through everything that's posted on there. And it wasn't because I didn't want to promote some discussion or debate. It's just that I didn't want to have the responsibility of monitoring the whole thing. I mean, those people, if they want to comment, they can start their own blog. I remember when I started blogging, by the way, I didn't really understand all the technical aspects of it, and I'm not a computer person, but I literally started my blog in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It is that easy.
Yes.
And there's very low barriers to entry. One comment on this whole civility issue, John makes a good point that some people like to snark up their blog posts because it will draw in traffic, and they think if they turn a phrase or if they're clever or if they come up with some unique insult that it will drive traffic. And I'm sure there are writers who use that tactic. In my case, I made a deliberate decision from the beginning to be extremely sober in my writing and to be extremely fact-based and to rely very heavily on, identifiable information that could be proven. And I also relied to a great extent on linking to certain news stories and then doing a content analysis, saying, here's this story that appeared in this paper today, here are the problems with it, here's what was not asked, here's what was not included. And so that kind of writing and criticism is, it's not very snarky. Mm-hmm. I mean, it all depends on your style. I don't like the heavily acerbic, snarky style because I feel like I'm not learning anything. I mean, I want to consume information that's fact-based and that can help me make decisions. And I know what the talking points are. You don't have to tell me those. I want to go to the next level and get a higher degree of information, and that's why I think blogs are helpful.
Mm-hmm. So you can tell he's a professor, or an ex-professor, actually, a political professor. Well, one of the questions that we really ought to think about is civility always good? And partly this is a matter of sort of thinking about what we mean by civility, but our country was founded in a pretty incivil act. That is a revolution. There's hardly anything civil about revolutions. It's just really hard to be civil in a revolution, and one has the feeling that people in the United States had some really nasty things to say about the king along the way. And the king probably found it quite incivil. Now, there are people today who are saying things about the 1% and some bankers. And I'm pretty sure that those bankers find this quite incivil. And so the question becomes, okay, do we always want to say that civility is a sort of dominant theme, or are there times when you think that a revolution or something really needs to be done that's going to require conflict, and that conflict is surely going to lead to at least some people thinking that that's really not appropriate and is very uncivil? So let me ask my friends if they can think of places where it would be less appropriate to be civil than being uncivil.
Well, I think the 1%, the Occupy Wall Street movement is a perfect example of this. And if we think back a little further to the beginning of the year, the Arab Spring is another example of this. And I think what we see is in cases where civility is becoming conflated with complacency or often oppression versus incivility being conflated with rebellion, dissent. And so then you start to tease apart these terms where it's not such a clear black and white picture where it's always better to be civil versus incivil, because like you said, the recipients of that incivility, might have different definitions of what they think is polite discourse, what they think is acceptable. And in some cases, incivility is the only option, like we were saying earlier, to create public voice, to give public expression to groups of people who have been dehumanized, who have been marginalized, and who have frankly just been left out of the political discourse. Forget forget forcing them to be part of a polite discourse. They've just been completely left out of the discourse themselves. And so to force themselves into that dialogue and debate sometimes needs incivility, to think outside of the rules that have been created without them at the table.
I'm pretty sure that burning bras was not understood as a civil act when it was a political act, and so we should not always think that incivility is something that we're not going to have as a part of our politics. Politics is going to be contentious, and so I'm going to stop talking there and turn it over to the Johns and let them talk about this.
We had exactly this discussion in Iowa about 2 months ago. We got into a really, really good flame war for about a week in the Iowa blogosphere. If you're familiar with Citizens for Community Improvement, which is largely based out of Des Moines, they like to release, and I'm going to display some bias here, they like to release a lot of self-congratulatory press releases about how they made demands and they held various elected officials responsible. They're generally on the left, but they're not really aligned with the Democratic Party, whereas I see myself more as a Democratic Party activist, a progressive Democratic Party activist, but solidly within the party ranks. Well, in Carroll, Senator Chuck Grassley held a town hall meeting, and a number of CCI activists were present, and there was some shouting down, and there was some mobbing on the way to the vehicle. And I wrote about this independently. Like three separate people grabbed this ball and ran with it. I'm sitting at home, my inbox pops up with another self-congratulatory press release about how we demanded that Senator Grassley do this, and that we held him accountable. And I started twittering and I started writing, and my immediate response was, okay, where the heck were you guys when it was time to make get out the vote calls for Roxanne Conlon, who of course was Grassley's opponent, who was defeated? And simultaneously, former colleague of mine from Iowa Independent, Doug Burns from Carroll, was writing his account of the event. And then shortly thereafter, Sue Dvorsky, the Democratic Party chair, got involved in the discussion and shot out a press release denouncing the behavior at the meeting, not the specific issue stands, but specifically the behavior. Senator Grassley, I like personally. I've interviewed him a number of times. I've also voted against him a number of times. But I made the argument that no, you don't shout down people. That's not appropriate to the dialogue. And there was a strong response, mostly aimed at Sue and the party itself, partly directed at me, partly directed at Doug. Dino was thrown out there. I can't remember all the epithets that were thrown out there, but the argument that CCI made was this was an occasion where civility was not the appropriate response. The appropriate response was anger and rage at Senator Grassley's voting record. I believe the specific issue was Social Security cuts. And, I'm in agreement on that. I'm in agreement with their stance on the issue, but my argument is that the appropriate response to that is you're not going to persuade a 30-year Republican senator by yelling at him. You're going to change that vote in the Senate by defeating him. And eventually it went national. It blew up into a 2,500 comment flame war on the Huffington Post. So I don't think it ever really got resolved, and shortly after that, a lot of those same people got involved in the Occupy movement, and here we are today. I am very concerned at the recent discussions, and I believe they've largely been discredited, but the discussion that occupiers or other actors might actually disrupt the voting process at the caucuses. Now, the immediate organizers of Occupy are saying that that's not the plan, and I believe that you cross the line of civility when you're actually stopping people from voting. So.
Well, in the interest of bipartisanship and civility,
that's
John,
why we're here.
Let me just say,
my distinguished colleague.
Let me just say I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm on the other side of this, so I guess my comments are sort of self-serving, but to me, mobbing Senator Grassley, one of the more beloved members of the Senate, seems like a real dumb idea. And it just seems like something that will alienate thousands of voters and hurt your cause. I mean, Bob mentioned, is it okay to be uncivil in certain circumstances? And he mentioned the American Revolution. That's not very civil, he said. He's right, but remember what preceded the revolution. There were petitions by legislative bodies, there were petitions by representative assemblies, there were legislative acts and edicts and newspaper editorials and attempts at persuasion and many attempts to avert a revolution. And ultimately it didn't work, and so the revolution came. But you could see in what the American colonists were doing some steps that were logical and rational and well thought out and based in principle. But in other acts of uncivil behavior, I see no upside. I see no benefit to it. Attacking Senator Grassley in Carroll, Iowa, when he's talking to a community group, that just seems dumb to me. And, I realize I'm, again, on the other side of the ideological spectrum here, but I don't really understand what Occupy is doing all the time either. I don't know what it is they want. And when they attack the police in Oakland and they cause all these problems, it's not clear to me what they're after and what the end result is. I think they're just going to ultimately alienate a lot of potential voters. And I think what John does within the party structure in sort of an organized way is much more productive. When people act like the Occupy Oakland movement or whatever, when they act like that, here's a tip from the other side. They just help the conservatives. It's much more beneficial to the Democratic side of the equation to work within the system and try and persuade people. As John said, that's a very key phrase. Try and persuade people to change their minds. Just yelling at them and burning cars and causing riots is not going to persuade anyone. But
Can I respond to that for 1 second? I would just say, we've clearly heard criticisms on both sides of the spectrum about what exactly Occupy is doing right now. And I would just say that, from my own personal perspective, I think it's important to remember that what the movement is claiming that they're doing is not coming up with alternative policy proposals. A lot of the main organizers are not saying that they even want to do that. But what their purpose is to give a face and give expression to a large sense of frustration that's going on in the country right now over income inequality and over this sense of being marginalized outside of public policy decision making. I do think that there's something important in giving a face of humanity to that frustration. But as any social movement, the protests, the people in the streets are a part of a social movement, but they're not the entire movement itself. And so it's incumbent on people who may agree with what Occupy Wall Street is trying to say to find other avenues through lobbying, through writing, through other types of political debate to sort of, put those pieces together and make sure that maybe alternative policy proposals are put forth, but not by the people necessarily camping out themselves, because everyone has a role to play.
Yeah. And what I've seen with Occupy is that it's very decentralized, very localized, and there are a lot of distinct differences between individual Occupy groups. The Iowa City group is very, very different from the Des Moines group. I know several of the people who are working in Iowa City, and they're also regulars at the monthly Democratic Central Committee meeting. In Des Moines, it seems to be more a confrontational group of people. For example, they deliberately chose the Capitol grounds for their initial camp out, in part, to tempt arrest, to tempt a confrontational situation, because frankly, I think that some of the same people who were involved in the dust-up with Senator Grassley kind of moved themselves into controlling positions in that group, and they, there's a few of them who frankly, get their kicks out of getting arrested. Iowa City, it's a little bit different. They're a little friendlier. And also, frankly, the Democratic Party structure locally is, more progressive identified here.
And actually, the recent polling that I've seen as of late last week was that a vast majority of the general public, we're talking about 70 to 80%, are in favor of this movement. So that's across party lines.
For one more number, there's 2,500 occupies across the world. 2,500 occupies across the world. This is really a very big global enterprise, and and to the extent that it's held together by social media. That is, they communicate with each other, they respond to each other, they support each other. I
can't even envision it without social media.
What?
I can't even envision it without
right.
social media.
And so, so all of a sudden we have the ability of people to express themselves, and it doesn't always come out as polite as one might think, but it is really very hard to have substantial social movement without some impoliteness. It just really does seem to be very difficult to make that move. Okay, now we have a few more. Yes, there's a few more minutes, and we should allow people to ask questions and make comments. And we've got somebody in the back who wants to do that.
The comments of the normal panel. One of my questions is, lately some newspapers, including the one registered, have gone to Facebook to post their comments on the story. One thing I've noticed is that they have their own check system in the past with the register. You have to register under your real name, and they would use something like Iowa Diane or something like that. But now you have to go to Facebook, and what I've noticed is when I go into the comments section to read on it, there's no comments. And so what are your comments about newspapers doing that?
No comment. No. Well, I mean, we've had this the same issue locally as Jeff will attest here. The comments in the Press Citizen. There was an effort to set up a real name board for comments, and that got far less traffic than the traditional where real names weren't used. And again, I made the mistake of signing in with my real name simply because I didn't know better. Actually, I've decided that's an honorable thing to do. Anonymity or even distance through a social medium seems to increase the venom levels more than you would in, say, a face-to-face conversation. I had a social media argument last night and this morning with people where I said things I wouldn't have said in person. I used a couple epithets I wouldn't have used in person. I was in an uncivil mood. One of my candidates had been defeated last night in our local election. And it simply seems that anonymity amplifies that. Yet at the same time, I can also see where there are circumstances where anonymity is necessary. For example, in a situation where employment may be at risk.
I would just, I think a general rule is be very skeptical of people who won't sign their names to things. And if you're involved in social media, you have a blog or whatever, I would strongly urge you to push people to sign their names. Because if you're not willing to put your name at the end of whatever you're saying, then you probably shouldn't be saying it.
There's one other thing to be said about this, and that is that, well, let me talk about members of Congress. Members of Congress most of them have Twitter accounts now. Almost nobody pays any attention to them. The reason they don't pay any attention to them is they don't say anything interesting. And you might think that newspapers are in something of the same, that is, the way they couch things, they're not making this interesting enough for people to want to comment about what they're saying. But we've got another question.
I just would comment on Twittering and congressmen.
Yeah.
I think Senator Grassley has one of the best reputations in Washington for interesting tweets.
Oh, yes. Bipartisan agreement on that.
Right. That is correct. Senator Grassley is somebody who people read. There are a few others that people read, but most of them are pretty boring. But let's see. Here and then there, okay?
If civility is about persuading others, I'll be provocative, but I'll be about whether that happens in social media. I wonder what your opinion is about self-segregation, self-selecting sources and selecting sources in and out. And if you mapped people's connections, including sources, news sources, blog sources, as well as Facebook and Twitter, whether you would find that the ideological divide is just as strong as ever and people self-segregate beautifully.
Well, I think there is probably a lot of that, and I would encourage everybody to read the best material that the other side puts out, because we all kind of know what our inclinations are, and we can just gravitate to sources of information that just reinforce that. But it's much more interesting to hear the strong arguments from the other side. Like, I'm a religious reader of the New Republic, for example, because it's smart, it has good data, it's got smart people writing for it, and it's just not talking points, which I already know what those are. And they might surprise you, and they might have an interesting take on things, and it's honest. But I agree. I mean, I think one of the problems with this universe is that people can just subscribe to things on Facebook or whatever that they know will reinforce their worldviews. That's not helpful.
Sometimes people ask me where I get some of my story ideas, and I tell them I read Republican blogs. That's where I get the idea. And people are just shocked that you're doing that. I have a lot of Republican readership. I read a lot of Republican sites. I think that's enhanced my credibility as a writer and as an activist. And one of the things as a writer that you have to do is you have to be able to call your own side out when it's deserved. In fact, with the whole dust up with CCI, a Republican blogger actually called that my Sister Soldier moment, which was very painful to hear.
I actually think just as network analysis has become more rigorous in political science, I think tracking the analytics of something like Twitter is gaining more ground. At CAP we have specifically a position that looks at our presence on Twitter and not only tracks, which pieces are gaining the most support from followers who we would think, sort of preaching to the choir, but also how are we faring with the opposition? And at that point it becomes really interesting to us because that's the dialogue that we're looking at, right? And as John was saying, I mean, I would definitely agree with going after the best that your opposition has to put out, because in my mind there are two types of social media, and let's use Twitter as an example. One is the type of Twitter where we know Kim Kardashian and Shakira are two of the top three, Twitter tweeters.
Lady Gaga's number one by a long shot.
Right. And so when you know that, then that becomes much more of a fan club to me. You have followers. It's not the two-way dialogue that I think the other type of Twitter, in my mind, is promoting. And when you look at those analytics, it might not be gross numbers, but you have back and forth tweets. So you actually have a dialogue happening out there in cyberspace. It's not just someone posting their latest thought or whim and other people consuming it. It's actually a back and forth. And so I think, as we move forward, the analytics of this are going to become really interesting.
It's interesting. I joke about Lady Gaga, but she's also used her prominence in social media to promote a political agenda. She's been very, very prominent on LGBT issues and other issues, primarily LGBT issues. So she's using her celebrity as amplified through social media to promote a cause she cares about. She's got substance.
Just wondering your perspective on how social media was involved, or how much it was with the Tea Party in the beginning, and progression with it, and also then becoming a conversation again.
I don't know. I would bet the farm that Facebook and email and blogs were very instrumental in that, though. It just seems like it's just a simple way to organize people.
One of the points at which I knew social media had made it was early in the 2008 primary process when John McCain was pointing out the expansion of media at a town hall in New Hampshire, and he was saying, now you've got your cables, you've got the bloggers, I hate the bloggers. And that little YouTube clip kind of took off as a social meme, and I admit to using it on a very regular basis. So I think social media had clearly made it by that point. And then in early 2009, when the Tea Party movement really got started, I do think that social media, although I'd say social media probably had more role in the rise of Occupy than it did in the rise of the Tea Party, because of course there was the Fox News outlet and talk radio that it also amplified. So there were more traditional media in addition to social media that were amplifying the Tea Party movement.
And it's not just in the United States. The revolts in North Africa and the Middle East in the spring of this year were very much organized by both Twitter and Facebook, and also YouTube. That is, they were very important in that, and they play a really important function both in terms of helping people organize themselves, but also helping them reinforce each other that what they're doing is meaningful and real, and that they can stand as a people against tyrants. And that, it turns out, has been replicated in other places, but that's really been an important part of what the social media have helped produce, is people feeling that they can stand against some kind of tyranny, that something that they understand to be tyranny.
Yes, 30 years ago, country America was in a better position. We had Steve Jobs, John Cash, had Bob Hope. Today we got no jobs, no cash, and little or no hope. So what I'm getting at is that you think that right now, through social media, people have finally come to realize that they all share that common level of frustration, and that it is time, as a globe, as a world, to act before it gets any worse. I think you touched upon it when you talk about where is the line, when is it the need for uncivility. And I think, and I'm wondering if it is the time. I wonder if the time is now.
Well, I think, going back to what Bob was just saying, in the international context, I think you can compare maybe America using social media, or the manifestation of social media and how it's developed in America, versus a lot of our international counterparts, to maybe test that question. And I think that also points to the idea, I think on this panel we reached a sort of consensus about the dangers of anonymity in the U.S. context. But if we take that internationally, you see cases where anonymity is actually a cloak of protection, and it actually enables people to be incivil if it equates with dissent, and so you're looking at cases like China, you're looking at cases like a number of the countries that went through the Arab Spring, where we couldn't ask people to attach their identities to their expression because that would explicitly be cracked down upon, right? So, I'm not quite sure if I'm speaking to your question particularly, but in my mind, I think there's a connection between reaching a certain point of civil liberties in a country that allows us to be incivil in a way that means dissent, but not, disrespect or dehumanizing or personal attacks. There are different meanings of that incivility. And I guess I would just also add the point that I think in any of these cases that have been brought up, the civil rights movement, any case of civil liberties, the revolution, these were all cases that we see maybe as incivility technically, but I think it's only incivil because it was challenging the definition of what was civility at that time. There's no constant definition of what civility means because, at different snapshots in our history, that has precluded certain groups of people from having civil liberties. So I think it's that tension of constantly trying to evolve what civility is even means in our discourse.
And Iowa civility is different than New York civility.
That's surely true. Okay, another question. Yes.
How responsible for the political polarization in one of the things do you think social media is, or is it?
I think perhaps it amplifies it. It allows people, social media allows people of like mind, whatever that like mind may be, whether it be obsession with a certain brand of toy or a certain brand of politics, it allows them to obtain a critical mass and mutually support each other. One of the phenomena I noticed in the 2007-2008 caucus cycle with the Ron Paul campaign was it was difficult to ferret out what the genuine level of support was amidst the noise. I mean, are there a lot of people who are coming from this perspective, or is it just a few people who are making a lot of noise? But I can say that that particular campaign and that particular candidate, that particular poll of the multipolar current version of the Republican Party wouldn't have evolved without that ability to connect. That 10% factor that was geographically and otherwise scattered would not have been able to coalesce, and that coalesced into another pole. I don't know if bipolarization is right. Maybe multipolarization is another way to look at it.
Are there any differences in the way the two political parties in Washington use social media more formally, or ways that they use social media differently?
Well, on the Senate side, most of the people in the leadership have Twitter accounts and they do Facebook, and of course the Senate conference and the Senate Policy Committee put out materials using social media, which can be followed by anybody, but it's often picked up by political reporters, etc. I've seen it written that the Democrats were kind of ahead of the curve on this, and I think the Obama campaign in 2008, they say was ahead of the curve on some of the social media, which could be true. But I think parity has been restored, or it's returning to parity if it was ever unbalanced, because it's so easy to do. I mean, there's no excuse for not being active on the social media front. Maybe there's some data.
The people who count Congress will tell you that the Democrats are behind the Republicans in Congress. Now, that doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is behind the Republican Party, but it does mean that Democratic members of Congress have been slower to pick up on social media than have Republicans. And that probably has something to do with the leadership, because Mr. Boehner is very actively involved in social media and has emphasized to his troops that they should do that. Mr. McConnell is a little less enthusiastic about it, as far as I can tell. But there are some differences in terms of which parties are doing what with it.
Yeah. In Iowa, at least, there's a very different approach in the from the blogs. Until a couple of years ago, the rightosphere, as I call it, in Iowa was somewhat decentralized. They eventually coalesced under the website theiowarepublican.com that's run by several former high-level GOP staffers. I'm sure that there's some money involved somewhere. I'm not sure where that is. I respect them as writers. I disagree with them from time to time. On the left, it's kind of more independent operators right now. You've got Blog for Iowa, you've got Bleeding Heartland, you've got myself. We had kind of coalesced under Iowa Independent, which was somewhat of we were a professional journalistic site, but we were clearly coming from the progressive end of the perspective. My attitude as a writer is always, okay, yeah, you know where I'm coming from. Now I'm here to hear what you have to say. But right now, I'd say as far as the Twitter/Facebook end of things, I'd say it's relatively at relative parity in Iowa. As far as the blogging end of things, it's more professionalized on the Republican side. I mean, frankly, after leaving Iowa Independent in November 2008, I've been able to do less writing and attend fewer events because I'm not subsidized the way I was. I got a day job. I'm taking time off the day job right now to speak to you. And there's a limit as to how much of that a working stiff like me can do.
I'd like to address a question, at least initially, and go through that would be great. A dimension, I think, of social media that we maybe haven't explored we tended to speak about in terms of politics that has been front and center. And social media, this is sort of a global question. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, we take the social part of social media. People were talking about everyday life, world matters. And they're actually talking to each other. Even though they're in their own studies, in their own rooms, and they're not in the old classical civil society meeting with the Lions Club and sharing breakfast and whatever. But they're in their life world through these media. I'm wondering to what extent you perceive the possibility or do you see the evidence of social media beginning to reconnect kind of like the factors, with raised kids in today's environment. In terms of agenda setting, broader sense of agenda setting, that holds the political system somehow somewhat more accountable to how their opinions formulated in the discourse with agendas. I was wondering if you have some of that level of political, kind of, not grassroots in the sense of occupying and all of that, people, but more in the broader sense of kind of setting agenda of things we care about.
Sure. I mean, I can kick off with saying I completely believe that it is shifting to more agenda setting than necessarily just self-interested silos, and that's mainly because not only on one hand is there an interest, I think, from a lot of, I'll take Washington as an example, of some agenda setters caring about democratic, substantial input, from the polity. But I think, on a more selfish, self-interested kind of way, it's also about garnering support, and knowing that if the game has been chosen and the game is now social media, the rules might be evolving of how we use it on each side of the aisle or each side of the ideological spectrum, but we're going to have to play the game. And the game has connected the polity with the agenda setters. And I think how we move forward is a good question, and I think it's one that, a panel like this starts to explore, a symposium like this starts to explore, but we're just going to have to make sure that there is accountability and there's respect. There's a sense of civility, however we come to a definition of what that civility is, in that discourse, so that we make sure that the value of social media is that people are coming together again, and they're using that social capital to make sure that our policy agenda is more inclusive of the country.
It's also interesting to think of the limits on social media as a chunk of the electorate. There are still a lot of people who really aren't plugged in or are barely plugged in, who will, check their email but aren't, actively participating in political blogs or political Facebook forums. I'm struck by the example, the White House recently, they opened up a forum for people to input what issues they want change on. And the overwhelming number one choice, driven by social media, was drug law reform. And the White House dismissed it out of hand.
Yeah, well, they've been worrying about that for a long time. That was the very first one they did. Okay, it's time to go. And we've got things to do next, and it's time to start doing those things next. So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, everybody.